So welcome to the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting of the Vermont Climate Council, our first meeting of 2022. Today's agenda includes substantively a review of the request for information being developed on life cycle analysis pursuant to our recommendations previously that were adopted by the Council. A scope of work update for the measurement and assessment or monitoring and assessment protocol and process going forward. And then discussion of the subcommittee composition and the work ahead of us in 2022. After that, we'll leave time for public comment before adjourning at 4. Does anybody have any comments or additions to the agenda? Okay, hearing none, we can go with that. First up, before we get into the more substantive items, there were minutes that were linked in the agenda from December 15th, our last meeting. Does anybody have comments on have had a chance to review them?
I didn't notice. Is the most recent version posted? Did that include those minor kind of typo changes that I'd caught previously? Okay, great. Thanks.
I do see one as I'm looking at it now, and I will bring it up. If we could, Leslie Ann's name is spelled wrong. There's no E on the, well, there's 2 E's in Leslie Ann, but none on the Ann part. Supposed to be.
Well, TJ, thank you so much for catching that. I didn't want to be the one to kind of raise it.
That's usually the first thing I look for now.
That's kind of scary, actually.
Mm-hmm. So with that change, any other comments on the meeting minutes? Without any other objection, we will consider those meeting notes approved. Thank you all. And
just before we move on, I just wonder, can we pause? This may have already been figured out, but I just want to make sure we have clarity on who's recording minutes for today.
Thank you, Jared. That has not
thanks.
been figured out.
Jared, I can do that today.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Yep.
Megan, will you have support in that? Because I'm about to turn it to you to talk about the RFI. So I hopefully it's not just I mean, so you can engage.
We, I think folks from the air quality team can be taking minutes for these meetings. And I'll admit that we do rely on reviewing the video for any details that we missed. So I think it'll be fine. Thank you.
Great. All right. Thanks. Thanks, Jared, for raising that. Okay, so with that, we can dive right into our first topic, which is the progress on the RFI that has been drafted. And I think I'll just turn it right over to Megan to lead this topic.
Yeah, sure. So we talked about this in our meeting in December, and the plan that we laid out at that point in time was for ANR to take a stab at drafting the RFI, which we've done. And I just want to give some credit to Jeff Merrill on our team, who couldn't join this meeting today, but has been working with us again at DEC on greenhouse gas inventory related matters on a temporary basis for this winter. And so he was really helpful in getting that draft off the ground. And I'm sure he'll be participating in future conversations with this group as well. But anyways, so we developed that draft, and then we sent it to the inventory task group that had been established within this subcommittee for their review last week. And then upon receiving comments from that task group, the DEC team reviewed those comments and incorporated feedback and edits, and sent around a clean version for this group for today. So that's the version that you're seeing today, is one that has been reviewed and commented on by that task group. So I'm happy to walk through the draft if that would be helpful for folks and maybe highlight a few things. Okay, I'm going to try to share my screen. All right, can folks see that? Okay.
Yes, that looks great.
Okay, so just in case folks haven't had a chance to take a look, this is our standard RFI template that we use within DEC, but just for folks' awareness, recording has stopped. Okay, sorry. Jane's going to be the point of contact from A&R on this RFI, and we're setting the stage here for the RFI based on the existing work that we do related to our greenhouse gas emissions inventory that you're all very familiar with, and the basis for that work and the types of information that we and methods that we rely on to conduct that inventory. And then, discuss some of the background related to the Climate Council process and this being incorporated and adopted into the initial climate action plan. Little legal disclaimer here regarding, what an RFI is versus an RFP. And then the really critical piece here is the statement of need and then the scope that follows. But this is just really the meat of the RFI, where we talk about exactly what we're asking people to answer here. And of course, we want to understand why people are qualified to respond to the RFI and what experience they have. And then we also want to understand, the different perspectives that might be out there in the community that considers these questions and these types of inventories, like what their view of what it means, what life cycle means, what upstream means for the purpose of this analysis. Any issues on focusing solely on life cycle emissions related to energy supply, which is what is specifically referenced in the Global Warming Solutions Act. Examples from other states. Software, data, specific methods that would likely be utilized in this effort in conducting the analysis. And, is there anything else available? And what would be recommended? What specific training or software might be required? And then, number of persons that would be required to do this work within the course of a year. And, do we have sufficient data? That's always a really critical question when we're talking about inventories and, being able to reference our baseline years and things like that. Other challenges in methodology, data limitations, data gaps, things like that. How the life cycle analysis might inform or interact with the existing greenhouse gas emissions inventory, which I think is a really important question, because I think, at least from A&R's perspective, we're interested in a life cycle analysis existing alongside the emissions inventory, but not being incorporated into the existing inventory. And then just, some other questions about, how to maximize usefulness of an analysis so that we can make good decisions with the product that is eventually created. And then pretty much, any other relevant information and the respondent's capacity to provide the assistance that we might eventually be asking for. Any questions on that? I know there's a lot, a lot there, so.
This is Richard. I have half a dozen comments, but I'm willing to see what other people say first.
go ahead and start with a couple, and maybe that'll foster conversation.
I'm sure it will. First of all, I really appreciate the opportunity to look at this a couple of weeks ago, and to make comments on it. And it is evolving, and it is good to see that it is evolving. Item 2 in your list of in the statement of needs section is the only place where you mention upstream. So the whole rest of the document is about life cycle. So I think it would be a little puzzling to somebody who wanted to fill in this RFI as to why all of a sudden we're bringing in the term upstream. So that's one comment.
Richard, if I may, just building on that comment really briefly, as I know Megan and team from DEC will know, I kind of made a similar comment throughout the document and had kind of recommended the inclusion of language of life cycle and or upstream, because it seemed that we wanted to kind of better understand either existing or proposed definitions for those terms, because I could see either, depending on interpretation and depending on the exact definitions used, being kind of useful for what we need to do and compliant with the Global Warming Solutions Act. But I do think that there is kind of a working definition within DEC ANR that, correct me if I'm wrong, Megan or Colin or team, but that led you to want to kind of just address that in one place versus throughout. And I'm just wondering if you can say a little bit more about that. I'm kind of curious what Richard thinks. I'm also happy to share some of what I was wondering about when I raised the question, but I'd love to hear how you all received those comments and why you ended up in this place and kind of what your working definitions or thinking is there.
I was perfectly happy with Jared's suggestion that we talk about upstream and or life cycle throughout the document. It just seems a little strange to me if we're going to only talk about life cycle, why we even introduce the concept of upstream. I mean,
So I can start, and then I know that Colin and Brian are both on the line today, so I really welcome them to participate in responding to these comments. We, so I'll share that when we received the initial set of comments from the inventory task group last week, our team within DEC got together, and Brian specifically did a great job at just kind of organizing our thoughts in our internal team about these terms and the different definitions that we could utilize. And there are a lot of different interpretations, I think, of a lot of these terms, and so we're trying to wrap our head around what terminology we could best use, while at the same time inviting respondents to potentially dispute our interpretation of some of these terms. And I think that is why we invited respondents to offer, what their best interpretation would be of life cycle versus upstream. But just to answer your question, I think we removed the reference to the references that you had added, Jared, of consistently saying throughout the RFI life cycle or upstream, because we thought that based on our interpretation of what a life cycle analysis is, and our best understanding of what it is that we're trying to accomplish in this effort, based on what was adopted in the Climate Action Plan and all of the, what we understand the need to be here. And the questions that we want to answer is that life cycle analysis was really the most appropriate term to be focusing on in this RFI. And, I think upstream focuses on those emissions that are occurring, prior to the use of a product or a particular service, that use stage. And whereas life cycle, I think is broader, and at least that's our interpretation within our team. And so we thought that it would be appropriate to focus on life cycle being the more kind of broader analysis. But if I'm getting that incorrect, Brian or Colin, please jump in.
This is Richard again. I don't feel strongly about, especially with that explanation about including the term life cycle and or upstream. I still think, though, that it would be more straightforward to just define what you mean by life cycle and leave the word upstream out.
I mean,
So
the way that, so if it's okay, just briefly, and then I'd love to hear what Colin has to say about this. I mean, my sense is that one of the reasons that life cycle can be confusing is that it's depending on whether it is applied to products versus fuels, it means different things. So there's a lot of life cycle analysis that's kind of cradle to grave around, you know, the life cycle emissions of a product's kind of creation, use, and then disposal. Whereas life cycle there's kind of a life cycle analysis that can be related to a product that is often kind of referred to in a consumption-based inventory, which this is not necessarily pointing to. I think life cycle analysis, as it's applied to fuels, energy use in terms of fossil fuels, biofuels, electricity, is something different, which is basically the combination of upstream emissions and the emissions that happen at the point of use or at the burner tip. And so one of the reasons that, I mean, I kind of, if the current inventory is looking at our in-boundary sector-based emissions, when it comes to energy, that is related to our fuel use. And so if this supplemental analysis is going to build on that, then it seems like what we're really pointing to for life cycle analysis of energy use is the kind of emissions at the burner tip, the point of combustion, plus upstream emissions behind that. And so that was the question in my head. Is it clearer to just say we're looking at the end use emissions plus the upstream emissions, and that's what we mean by life cycle, to avoid the potential confusion around we're not talking about a whole consumption-based inventory that's going to look at every product created, its global supply chains. That just becomes incredibly complex, costly, with a very low degree of confidence that we're actually getting at that. And so I guess I want to hear what Colin has to say next, but I'm wondering, Colin, do you share that same interpretation, that when we're talking about, like, your working in interpretation of life cycle for purposes of how it would be used by ANR would be basically applied to fuels, electricity and fuels across all energy sectors, point of combustion or use emissions, plus the upstream emissions behind that, and related to production, transportation, refining, etc.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, I honestly am not a life cycle or upstream expert, but that would kind of be my understanding. I think the reason that we kind of didn't use the dual term is that we kind of wanted whoever responds to this RFI to kind of lay out their thoughts and kind of define it for us and tell us what they would suggest, what would be more meaningful, whether it would just be the life cycle emissions, like, and I think this kind of gets into some of the real technical nature of a life cycle analysis. I think an upstream analysis is a much more kind of a straightforward, like you're saying, just point of combustion up. And if it is just from, or generation, I guess, for electricity, I mean, if it is just truly for electricity and fossil fuels, then I think maybe that makes sense. If we start to incorporate other pieces, like I keep going back to like EVs. So I feel like in order for this to be kind of a meaningful analysis, it's going to have to be kind of comparable with kind of the energy generation, but also the alternatives. And so EVs is what always comes up in my mind, or heat pumps. So it's kind of like you're not gonna account for the battery and production in an EV if you just do the life cycle or upstream emissions from energy generation or fossil fuels. And so you're going to be saying, oh, EVs are great. And I'm not saying EVs aren't great. I think they are, but I feel like we need to have that kind of apples to apples comparison. And that's where I kind of struggle with this whole thing, in that I'm having a hard time understanding. I guess I could see it for like renewable generation to say, and electricity generation to say, okay, these are the impacts of Hydro-Quebec. These are the impacts upstream, life cycle, whatever you want to call them, of solar. But I'm having a little bit of a hard time outside of that. Like just for the fossil fuels, I think we all know that we need to phase out fossil fuels, and I'm not sure that just kind of adding a multiplier to that makes that big a difference in terms of policy decisions. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling on, I think, but that's kind of my thoughts. But I totally agree. It's not an easy thing to wrap your head around.
This is Richard Hopkins again. My recommendation to ANR would be that you take Jared's definition and put it into here rather than say this is what we mean by life cycle. If you have any other recommendations, let us know.
I would just say, I don't know that my definition is right. I think there's different definitions throughout the literature. And I think part of what we want from this RFI process is for those definitions to be surfaced so that we can make a well-considered kind of way of, in the end, maybe when we issue an RFP, we'll have to be really clear on the definition. It doesn't strike me that we have to do that yet for an RFI, but I think what Colin's saying is that's really helpful to hear, because it sounds like there is a desire to focus on the life cycle related to the equipment and the manufacturing and the products like heat pumps and EVs. Whereas when I've kind of assumed that what we mean by life cycle emissions is similar to the way that life cycle emissions have been assessed for renewable fuel standards, either at the national level or the low carbon fuel standards in California, Oregon, and Washington, which is a life cycle assessment of the various fuels, both fossil and bio, which does not get into what is the life cycle emissions of producing the boiler that those fuels are then used in. So I don't know where that leaves us. I guess, overall, I agree that this is the time to surface different definitions so that we can get to greater clarity, certainly in advance of an RFP. But I don't know as though we need to agree on that now. I don't think we can. And I think part of the purpose of the RFI is to gather more information so that we can do that more confidently and clearly.
Yeah. Brian, and then Colin again.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. I'll note that we did in number 2 have originally a definition for what a life cycle inventory was, and you struck all that, which was great, because I think you're exactly right. We want to talk to these contract life cycle experts for them to define these terms for us, and to further have them inform us on what's the best way to get information about emissions, wherever we're doing it, as Colin said, that are policy informative in some way. And that includes not only the emissions that you get from a particular type of energy, but also how it is we're planning to use it. So I think being more generic here and allowing the contractor to be able to respond in a broad way is the direction that we're recommending that you go, because you want to really leverage the experience that the responders are going to have here. And you're 100% right. In the RFP, we're going to have to be very specific, but not quite yet.
This is Julie. Sorry, I'm just on the phone. I don't know if I could just offer a couple of comments and thoughts.
Yeah, go ahead, Julie.
Okay. So, I mean, I think part of the challenge in this and what I hear and what Colin was describing is at some point we're going to have to draw a boundary around what we're tracking. And we also have to be realistic about the resources the agency is going to have to do this work. So we can be as broad as we want in this RFI, but at the end of the day, we may have to sort of scale that back a little bit so that our interests better match our resources. And just want to make sure that we aren't so overly broad that we end up with this extremely far-reaching set of recommendations that the agency simply will never have the resources to be able to fully implement. And I don't know where that boundary is, but we do operate in a resource-constrained environment, and I think it has to be part of what we think about in constructing the input we're looking to receive in this RFI. And we'll fully own, I haven't had the time in the last couple of weeks to review the draft RFI, and can try to do that over the next several days. But I have some real concerns about being enormously broad. I think absent defining the fact that there are ultimately resource constraints in our ability to implement, we could end up with recommendations that simply are beyond the capacity of the agency currently or in the future.
Thanks, Julie. This is Megan. I just want to, briefly say that I as the working with the team that implements the current inventory and knowing how much of a lift that is, we certainly appreciate that. And I think we tried to balance, really, as Brian said, using this RFI as a resource to understand, what the community of experts thinks is the appropriate term for life cycle and upstream and other terms, while also asking for a lot of detail about exactly what would be involved in putting this type of analysis and implementing this analysis in the future, so that we have a really firm understanding of how heavy a lift it would be and what additional resources we would need to do that, and whether or not we could perform this work within our current boundaries of resources. So we did try to get that additional information as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Megan.
Lou, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thanks, TJ. I just wanted to say that this is a really great discussion. I think that it's entirely appropriate to look to the professionals when it comes to definition of life cycle and upstream. And I just wanted to tag off Secretary Moore's comments about capabilities, and recognizing that Vermont's a very small part of the stream, and that upstream from Vermont there's a lot of things that actors within the state won't have power to influence. And so it may be good to be aware of what those quantities are in terms of emissions and energy usage, but detailing them may not be so important, as we can't actually really affect them. So really getting a handle on what we can affect in state, I think, should be the top priority, with monitoring of other emissions would be good, but not as critical.
Thanks, Lou.
Are we back around to me? Can I say something?
Sure, go ahead.
There are things that we can't, that are outside the state, that we can't control, but we can control where we buy our power from. And if there are choices, and one supplier can document that their way of producing the fuel or the energy produces less greenhouse gases than the other guys, then that can be a factor in the purchase. The other thing I want to say is that the answers to some of these later questions about feasibility, and how much is it going to cost the agency to run this, and how many people is it going to take to do, the answers to those questions are going to be dependent in part on what your definition is of life cycle analysis. And the more things you include and the more complex it gets, the more expensive it's going to get. So the definition, I think, is going to be really important. Thanks.
Yeah, just tagging on that, I think what I was going to say is just going back to, I think, one of the original suggestions here of, further down from number 2 on this draft, unless I missed something, it seems like the RFI, we want to better understand each of the subsequent questions for life cycle and upstream or upstream, depending on how they define that. And so I think there was a suggestion to just use where it says life cycle beyond number 2 there, just say life cycle and or upstream. And then we can get the information that we need. I think RFIs, to Secretary Moore's point, can be broad, and we may, a respondent to the RFI may define something one way, and that will drive the answers to the rest of their questions in how they define it. And so, is that a solution to this in a better end result, or was there a reason that I missed that that wasn't an adopted suggestion?
If I recall correctly, and maybe Colin. Okay, I'll let Colin answer.
Oh, thanks, Megan. I was just going to say that I think, and Brian or Megan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the reason that we kind of ended up going with one rather than both is I think you could certainly get 2 very different responses if you asked a contractor, if one contractor was just going to give you estimates for upstream and the other was going to give you estimates for life cycle. It kind of gets to Richard's point about it, at least how I'm viewing it. Life cycle analyses are much more involved and complex. Certainly, if you do a whole comprehensive life cycle analysis, and I think we could talk about potentially setting boundaries on that somehow, although I'm not exactly sure what the best way to go about that would be. But upstream, I think, is much more limiting. So yeah, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I think that is kind of why we chose one or the other. But if I'm misremembering that, please correct me, Megan or Brian.
Well, thanks for that, Colin. It seems like that's information that might be useful to have out of this process, and I'm worried about process for process's sake sometimes, but this is, if we get information on what is comprehensive life cycle analysis, that cradle to grave analysis that says it's $3 million a year and it takes 18 months every time you do it, and it's just outside the scope of what A&R is going to feasibly be able to do. Well, this RFI process will show that, and then that really helps shape what we do want out of an RFP. And so I guess I think that stepwise path could be really valuable in saying, well, no, this subcommittee, the Climate Council, made a active decision to go one way or the other based on the information it received, on these questions.
Yeah,
that's a good point, TJ. Sorry, Jared, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see if there was anybody else with a hand. I was just going to say, I really agree with you, TJ. I mean, I am not a lawyer, but my plain reading interpretation, and thank you, Steve, for putting this in the chat, but then we're looking at what we need to, what the GWSA calls for is, tracking our emissions of greenhouse gases from within the geographical boundaries of the state, and those emissions outside the boundaries of the state that are caused by the use of energy in Vermont. I do think that it is a plausible or possible interpretation of that what that's asking for is a combination of emissions at the site of the use of energy, kind of site energy emissions or burner tip emissions, plus the upstream emissions before that occur out of state. I think you're right, Colin, that life cycle analysis is often, at least as applied to products, much more comprehensive and involved and complicated, at least from a cradle to grave perspective. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case on the fuels side, at least the extent to which I've looked into it. It seems like when life cycle analysis is done on the fuels side, it's basically, you know, the end use emissions plus the upstream emissions, and then there may be some other things, you know, that go into it. But I guess I'm just ending up in this place where I don't want to presuppose that what the law calls for, or what we need, or what will be helpful for us to act on is a life cycle accounting or analysis of all of our emissions. It may be an upstream accounting that we add to the existing, and that would certainly, in my, at least my understanding as it exists now, be more similar to the quote unquote life cycle analysis that's used for like low carbon fuel standards, for instance. I think we also need to have in mind this consideration of like, you know, are we pointing towards something that will be custom built for Vermont that is not used by any other jurisdiction? Or are we looking for something that can, you know, build on the research and work that has happened elsewhere and might eventually be able to be alignable or complementary to some other systems? I think we do want to look for something that can be kind of sustainable and useful for the long term, and not just kind of a kind of an odd interpretation that only suits our purposes or is only applicable here.
So I'll go. I agree with you, Jared, that it can be a little more straightforward to perform those life cycle analysis if you're just talking about fuel, because then you're talking about raw materials extraction, processing, transportation, and then the use is you know, that's beyond, that's at the point of combustion, and then there is no disposal that happens. And you can define that system boundary that way, if you like. Depending upon the product or service that you're trying to analyze, it can be very complicated. If it's a complicated product with a lot of components, we were talking about EVs, that would be an example of something that would be a little more involved, because there's a lot of parts that go into it and a lot of energy that goes into making it. And then there's, unlike just an energy source, there is an end of life consideration, recycling or disposal that you have to manage. But there's folks that do this. We actually, a few years ago, the department was having applicants for Section 248 projects, and then they were all solar projects, do these life cycle analysis on the solar panels. And it was life cycle. It was from production, you know, from raw materials extraction all the way till end of life. And part of the reason we wanted to do that is because we were getting proposals that included taking down some forests to put up the like utility scale systems. And so we wanted to understand all of those, you know, all those components and how they affected the overall emissions as compared to if that energy was coming from, and what we used as the baseline was from the New England grid at the time. And you know, that wasn't a trivial exercise, but it wasn't massively complicated, and it wasn't prohibitively expensive for the large developers who we asked to do that. So I think you want to, I think what we want to hear from the experts about exactly what the level of effort is, and we ask that question. I don't have an objection to life cycle of you know, calling out upstream if folks really want that. I think and/or, as Colin suggested, is a kind of a confusing construction, because it allows the responder to say, well, I'm going to look at just this or just that. If you want to have an analysis of both of those, and we can make that clear in that you know, in this RFI, again, no objection to that. And then I think we have the luxury of looking at the responses and then saying, so what is going to be the most informative? What's going to be the most useful in order to be able to inform policy and to either get us or keep us on this track to meet the emissions reduction requirements.
So can I propose that we direct the work group to kind of better contemplate, language such as the life cycle and or upstream, but I hear Colin and Brian's point on the confusion there, but to better describe that we're looking for potentially both of those, and whether it's in the, a summary statement at the beginning of the questions or in each one, so that we can, I know that there's some other points to be made here, and we have until 3 o'clock for this discussion.
What you're proposing sounds fine to me as a member of said work group.
TJ, how about a construction, something like based upon your response to question 2, where they were going to be defining these terms for us, then use that as the lead in to the rest of the questions that ask for life cycle. So we allow the contractor to define those terms, which we want them to do, and then we allow them to apply them through the rest of the questions that we ask where it's relevant.
I was responding to TJ's procedural motion.
Yes, sir. Understood.
So that sounds good in concept, Brian. I think I still, it seems like I would almost want to look through again all the other questions to make sure it applies, but if I think that's what we could propose if that works, and then my guess is that the next couple of conversation topics we're not going to be able to go as in depth because we're not going to have time, and there may be other stuff for the work group to circle back on one more time and release the RFI. But so in concept that sounds good to me, but I want to give that work group one more chance.
That's fine.
Okay, great. So thank you all. That was a really good discussion. That's very helpful in my thinking of this as well. Richard, I know you had some other comments.
Yeah, I have one or two more that are non-trivial. In item 3, it seems that there's a list of in item 3 of the what constitutes our energy supply, and it doesn't mention hydroelectric, and I think it should. In the same way that it mentions nuclear generation, it should mention hydroelectric.
So, Richard, the former lawyer and me will point out that it does say including but not limited to. So
I get it, but I think
Oversight on my part, Richard. I made that list and I left that out.
On purpose or by accident?
But wouldn't that be included? It says renewable, and by law, Vermont defines hydro as a renewable, as does the federal government, hydro as a renewable resource. So wouldn't it be included in there?
Well, perhaps it would be, but is there any harm in mentioning it?
No, or if you wanted to put solar and wind in there too, that would be fine.
And then my other comment is on item 9. I think it is. Maybe this is a can of worms, but I would be interested in knowing whether any method that people develop for doing an upstream and or life cycle analysis could be used to make estimates retroactively to 2005 and to 1990, because those are the base years for the EWSA.
Yeah, thank you for raising that, Richard. I agree that's a really important can of worms in terms of how our Global Warming Solutions Act targets were set based on the current methodology, and if that there's substantial differences in sectors or in just the total greenhouse gas emissions, it could it could move the goalposts of what we're shooting for if we were to use a different approach. And so understanding what is possible on a backcast, I think, is really really useful.
Yeah, and so I just want to highlight that question 11, we do specifically ask folks to explain, challenges that they're recognizing that exist, including, potential data gaps. So we could be more specific about like what we're talking about there in terms of those challenges that you mentioned, Richard, if that would be helpful to kind of add more detail to number 11.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm done.
Colin, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I'm happy to put something specifically calling out those years or calling out the possibility of historical estimates. My very strong hunch is that is going to be incredibly difficult with all the data sources that are going to be needed to go into that analysis, especially kind of to have it at the same level of granularity or accuracy that a current one would be. But again, I'm not familiar with all those data sets, so maybe it's possible, but I would be surprised.
I'd just like to see that documented.
Yeah, I'm totally fine with that, Richard. I think that sounds fine.
Yeah, I agree with what Colin said. That might be really tough to go backward. No objection to including it. But I think it bears mentioning that our scorecard is going to be our existing, by law, it's the existing in-boundary sector-based inventory. This is supplemental and will be informative, and hopefully will be policy informative, but it's not the keep score. So just keep that in mind until someone changes the rules.
Yeah, thank you. So one more thing confirming the process now. Well, let me just say, are there any comments from subcommittee members or staff on the RFI? Okay, so just to confirm the process that I had just suggested, I guess those last changes, if they're made again by Brian or Colin or whoever's drafting it, and then circulated to the work group, is our committee members comfortable with delegating to that work group to sign off on the final product and that it can go out without the subcommittee seeing it again? Okay, I'm not hearing objections to that, so we'll tentatively call that the process, but I do want to leave an opening here. I put in the chat that Jared had suggested to me, and I think it's a good idea to actually open the conversation now for public comment on this issue, so that it's happening right now at the same time as we're talking about the RFI. So if there's, well, first it's a change to the agenda. So any objections from subcommittee members to opening it? No, hearing none, thank you. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on the RFI? Stephen, I saw your hand go up first, and then George.
It's a race. What do I win?
You win the opportunity to go first.
Okay, well, just a couple of quick comments. One, regarding that whole discussion about life cycle, et cetera, it seems to me like the important context is the statutory language that you're trying to follow with this. You know, both pieces from 578 and 582 in the law. And it seems like it would be useful to spell that out for the people who are replying to the RFI so they understand that context. And they might have some thoughts about how to negotiate that. And I think that the other thing the language does is some of this is sort of aspirational, but some of it has to be pragmatic. And I think the statutory language captures both of those things, and it sets out the challenge you're trying to resolve. So the other thing I wanted to bring up is the question of the 20-year versus 100-year time frame for assessing global warming potential. And that's one of those variables that is really important. A lot of people would argue that the 20-year is really essential because of the kind of challenge we're facing with the climate right now. And the 100-year window for some of those emissions just ignores the damage that they're going to do. So it seems like that should be in here someplace too. And maybe it's included in number 11, as you're just talking about, as one of those challenges, but it seems like one that's important enough to call out. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Any discussion or comment on that, on including essentially a reference to statute to give respondents context if it's not already in there? We have to look at it. And then elevating to, as an example, perhaps the 20-year versus 100-year timeline, global warming potential timeline.
I'm really glad Stephen brought that up. I'm embarrassed to say that in my quick review of the document, I didn't pick up on that it's important.
Thanks, Richard. Colin?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the global warming potential 100 versus 20-year choice. And I'm not going to say thoughts about including in this RFI, but I will say that it is kind of our tentative plan. It is our plan to incorporate those or to kind of do a second run, if you will, of the inventory and have that 20-year GWP, which is really going to have the biggest influence on methane emissions. That should not be that big a lift to kind of duplicate that. So that is our plan right now for the next iteration of the inventory. We're going to have to see what all that involves, but as of right now, I don't think it should be too bad to do that. So we're planning on incorporating that at least as kind of another value and how the inventory is going to look in terms of just a layout going forward. I think there's a lot to be determined after this whole climate council process and things to include and sensitivities and all that. But that's the plan right now.
Thanks, Colin. Richard, did you have another response? I noticed your hand, or is that an old hand? You're on mute.
In the context of an upstream analysis, one of the important contributors to upstream greenhouse gas is going to be fugitive methane released in the extraction and distribution of natural gas. And the impact of including or not including that is magnified by using the 20-year versus the 100-year factor. So it seems to me that the 20 years versus 100 years ought to be included in the current RFI as one issue we want the contractor to explore.
Thank you, Richard. Lou, go ahead.
Yeah, just echoing that sentiment that it seems very important to include in the life cycle analysis.
And Colin?
Sorry, I just wanted to clarify. I'm fine with including it in a life cycle analysis. I just did want to flag that we are planning to include that in the inventory as well.
Great. Was that? I haven't looked at it in a month. So was that one of the recommendations for sensitivity to use that we recommended? Thank you. Great. Already taking action on that. So I haven't heard any objections to including it in the RFI. So if the group can ensure that that's included as well. And thank you, Stephen. That was really helpful. George. Hi.
I did have a little bit of follow-up. First off, congratulations on all the work you guys have done in this area, and I'm glad to see it moving forward finally. With respect to what metric you use for measuring carbon dioxide equivalent, in November, they released, the IPC released the assessment report 6, working group 1, which is the one that does, in fact, one of the things they do is an assessment of metrics for global warming potential and other types of metrics. And there's a very elaborate discussion in that assessment report 6, which I think is relevant from those of you who have the interest in finding out. In particular, there's a lot of discussion about an algorithm that I'm aware of was brought out only about 3 or 4 years ago called Global Warming Potential Star. And it specifically deals with the idea of how one could conflate methane global warming potential with carbon dioxide. There's still going to be some subjectivity to it, but it's certainly a marked improvement over the current one, which doesn't acknowledge, global warming potential for a 100-year time horizon, doesn't consider this, if you will, duality of how methane and other short-term climate forcers are treated in regulatory contexts. So when you do your life cycle assessment and inventory and are recording emissions factors, it might be useful to carry with that the extra overhead of separate emissions mass for each of the relevant greenhouse gases. In other words, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and any others that might be relevant. And then it's possible in later years, if you need to revisit it, to compute an algorithm or a metric that isn't necessarily in common use today, but would become more so in the future. It's obviously not as convenient as having a single number to represent the emissions, but it allows the flexibility in future to change what I would call algorithm agility in how you measure your metrics. With regards to the rest of the RFI, honestly, I have not had enough time to look it over with any depth. I've had some other commitments that have kind of gotten in the way of that. Is there a window in which I can turn around comments to your group by which it would still be available to alter the outcome? TJ?
Yeah, I given that this was posted this week, I think, but I think that we could probably open a window if committee members don't object and staff.
TJ, can I just ask, in consideration of that question, Jane or Megan, do you feel, I'm kind of wondering, what do you have in mind in terms of an aim for, working backwards from a desired issue date so that we can figure out when to get the task group together one last time if necessary, and a deadline to receive any additional comments?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jared. I think we were aiming for release of the RFI by the end of this month. Was kind of our loose timeframe. So that gives us another week and a half or so. But that's, that's not a hard and fast date.
That would be fine with me. I think I can turn around any comments I have in that shorter time frame. It's just this week's kind of cluttered up with previous commitments and I'm not able to really focus on it. So I'll look at it from that perspective and I'll address the comments through the usual. I'm assuming your public comment portal is the usual frame, place to place such comments. And I'll be taking a look when I can.
Just to make sure it gets to us, George, I know you have my email. Please feel free to CC me and any other members of the task group, whether Megan or Richard that you may have, but I know you have my email. So if that works to see, I'll just help make sure that gets along. Does it make sense to see if we want to get that task group together middle to end of next week, and then we could have a deadline of, say, by close of business next Tuesday for comments? That might enable us to keep on the schedule that you just suggested, Megan, but provide a full week for public comment from the posting.
Sounds fine to me. I can organize that meeting of the the task group for later next week.
Great, thank you. Thanks, George. Thanks.
I'll proceed with that. Sounds good.
Thank you. So it looks like we have a path forward there. Thank you. Thanks, Megan, for presenting that. Next up on the agenda is our monitoring and assessment scope of work update. I think, is this, sorry, Jane, are you giving this update? I will kick it over to you.
Sure. Sorry, I wanted to put something in the chat. Miriam was just kind enough to update today's link to include the draft scope of work for the measuring in progress tool. I had hoped to have a more final version of this to share, and I couldn't remember when we last talked about this as a subcommittee what it looks like as I was scrolling back in meeting minutes as well as calendars. We've only ever looked at the framework together as a subcommittee, and based on that framework that Cadmus and EFG worked to put together, and that was included in the climate action plan, they drafted a scope of what a scope of work would look like to move forward with that framework in 2 phases. The first phase being sort of further refinement and planning for the tool. That phase 2 would then be the building of it, and that there was a logical break between those 2 things in the scope of work as envisioned. Based on conversations with them where we have furthered this work, the hope had been that ahead of this meeting, I would have the final scope of work and cost estimate from Cadmus and EFG. The understanding and expectation is that UVM would be helpful to be part of that proposal based on where we think we're going with the development of that tool. And you may recall Jillian Galford, who worked with us on the carbon budget. She was on maternity leave, and so she was meeting with Cadmus and EFG this week to help get estimates for what it would look like for UVM to be part of that proposal. So I don't have it yet. I will say that we'll have to make a decision internally with the support of that task group as well, whether or not we amend Cadmus and EFG's contract to work on, to continue this work with us, or whether we go and develop the RFP now to see it all the way through. Within their original contract, the development of this tool was in their original contract. So therefore, it would be just adding cost and time for the further work that we now understand and expect to build this. So it's within our reasonable scope to actually just add it to their contract. That said, it will be for phase 1, and therefore there could be some value in going out for phase 1 and phase 2 so that we don't have to do all this work with Cadmus and EFG over the course of the next 6 months, only to then do an RFP to actually build the tool. So all of this to say is that we see this as one of the most important sort of statutory requirements that the agency is still working on. We see it as likely needing further assistance from other council and subcommittee members because the tool itself is going to be bigger and broader and something that ANR has to manage indefinitely. And so we're working to get the scope. We're working to consider how we move forward with advancing the contract and what the right people are around the table to do that. And just aren't quite there yet to share the final cost and scope of work as Cadmus and EFG see it. So my recommendation would be that the small group that has met in the past would review and consider the proposal once it comes in from Cadmus and EFG, which we expect this week. And what is online now, just for folks' curiosity, is the scope of work that they provided mid-December to me based on the conversations that have unfolded with the task group to date. So that's really all I have to say, but happy to answer any questions or further consider how we move it forward with all of you.
Leslie Ann, go ahead.
Thanks, TJ. Jane, I'm not sure if you had a chance to chat with Secretary Moore in the last maybe 10 days or so. She and I are going to be meeting with the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, Bill Falls, next week to explore some of the ways in which some of the expertise around the college could be brought to bear with helping to move some of these implementation pieces forward. And my class, my satellite climatology class, is also helping with some of those in a service learning component. And so this might be a good time to sort of put all of these various ways of helping to move the various implementation parts together as we're having that. So happy to chit chat with you offline. And I'm not sure if Julie has mentioned it or if she's able to maybe just send you a quick email or whatever to at least put a pin there so that we can have a little bit of that conversation.
Thanks. It looks like Julie's switching to computer from phone, but I have not talked to Julie directly about that. So would love to hear her thoughts if she wants to offer any now, but we'll also look to follow up with you both going forward.
Absolutely.
Muted now?
You're unmuted, yeah.
All right, fantastic. I can follow up with Jane and Leslie Ann offline.
Okay, great. So what are the next steps? What do you see as the steps for this committee, Jane, in reviewing again? I know we saw that an early version and then the work group has worked on it. Is this a scope that's ready to go that we are looking to approve here, or and send you off to implement?
Yeah, so I guess what I would like to caution is that the scope of work may have been modified since a month ago, and if that was the case, then I think it would make sense for the small group to come together just to ensure that it is reflective of what has been discussed. If no substantive changes have been made, then I think that ANR can move forward with determining the best course of action via whether or not we amend Cadmus and EFG's contract to do the work or develop an RFP based on the scope of work as had been envisioned and collaboratively worked on with the task group to date. So I guess it's a little bit of a to be determined, but expect that if the scope of work is in line with what has been previously discussed, we will keep you up to date on progress with getting the services under contract. And then if any substantive changes have been made, I'll reach out to the task group to convene a meeting to discuss.
Okay, I think that sounds good. And I just, to be clear, I think this committee, if there are changes to the scope of work, is the committee comfortable with deputizing again the work group, sub work group to actually, respond to those changes and confirm whether they're good or not. Are there any objections to that? Okay, I just wanted that to be clear on the record that the committee is okay with that path and the work group taking on that role. All right, great. And so thank you, Jane, for pulling together the scope. And I neglected to say thank you to Colin and Megan for drafting the RFI, and Brian for drafting the RFI, and the work group for engaging in that, you know, some substantive discussion before this meeting. I think it's looking good, and we're going to get a lot of good information out of it. So it's much appreciated, and wanted to share that. So the last substantive item here on our agenda, sorry, my agenda disappeared when I opened the new draft, but it's subcommittee composition. And so I think there's a few things to discuss. One, we're a relatively small committee to start with, that we could use some help, I think, and in just broadening perspectives and potentially diversifying. Two, I wanted to say that I need to step down from being co-chair of this committee. It's been really a pleasure to serve on it, and great experience working with all of you and learning as we go in areas of the greenhouse gas inventory in particular for me, but other areas as well. I will be joining the cross-sector mitigation committee in my new role here at the department as the director of planning. In stepping down, that so that a discussion for potential co-chair is something to talk about here. And then I'm not sure if everybody is aware here, but Lou Ciceri, could explain this also, is now a member of the department. He was at Velco and is now at the department. And you know, the department would like to propose that that Claire McElvany, who's been staffing this committee, become a member, and that in that case, it's probably not appropriate to have two people from the department be members of the committee, and then Lou would step down. And the reason for that is really just Claire's engagement in experience in data management and a data project at the department, and also equity experience that she's developing and bringing. And I think that would be really great for the committee. So I'd like to nominate her to be on the committee. So there's
I guess I'll second that motion if you need it, and you'll be in great hands with Claire. Been a pleasure serving with you all.
Well, I know we do need to figure out kind of next steps on, you know, what to do with those recommendations and the future of the subcommittee composition. But before we do that, I just want to pause to just say thank you so much to TJ and Lou for your service over the last year. There's been so much that's gone into crafting agendas and doing outreach to subcommittee members, and really working on a fast timeline, and just the contributions you both have made have been significant. And so understand it, but sorry to see that happen, and really grateful for all you've done in the last year.
Thank you. Leslie Ann?
I just wanted to add my personal thanks to both TJ and Lou, and TJ in particular. I think you've become a real friend, and I think part of these processes are on a personal level as well as on a sort of professional level. And for all of our talks and all of our conversations, all of the support at really, really difficult times in the last year. I just wanted to go on public record as saying thank you for that. It means so much to me that you can't imagine. So thank you.
Thank you for that. And yeah, I feel the same way. It's funny how we've met so many times on Zoom. For most of us, there's, some of you I have met in person before, or seen occasionally, but meeting in Zoom over and over, it's kind of surreal, like when you actually see somebody in person. And it hasn't happened yet, Leslie, and I hope it does happen sometime soon and is able to. But yeah, I feel the same way. It's great. It's been a great process.
And then we can say, oh, you're taller than I thought you were, or you're shorter than I thought you were, so all that good stuff. Yeah, you gotta say it, right? Okay.
I mean, TJ, I don't know, it sounded like there was kind of a motion on the floor to have Claire join as a member of the subcommittee. Happy to second that or vote in favor of that if that's what Lou was doing. I don't know if we want to pause to do that, but Claire has just been such an incredible contributor as a staff member, and if that's kind of, I mean, that seems like the prerogative of the PSD as the PSD commissioner's designee to kind of replace that, but to the extent it's helpful to kind of formally accept that as a subcommittee, would love to do so.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Jared. I am not read up on the formal process for doing that for these committees, so maybe that's why Jane raised her hand.
No, I of course wanted to echo my appreciation for TJ and all that he's done managing both the climate action plan as well as the comprehensive energy plan simultaneously. I'm sure it was no small feat, and it's been a pleasure to work with TJ in this role, and excited that he'll still be working with us. So thank you. And then as far as Claire, I think that yes, you will put her forward, and the process is really that when there are changes to subcommittee composition, they go in front of the steering committee to be blessed. So all these changes will be updated on the official subcommittee membership list, which lives on our website, and advanced at the next steering committee meeting for their official approval. I don't expect there to be any problems with that, but officially that's the way it's been working. So we'll do that. And then just one comment on co-chairship, just as a reminder for folks. This also based on the roadmap that was put and adopted by the Climate Council for subcommittee co-chairs. It is intended that the co-chairship be filled by two counselors, one representing the seat of an administration official and one representing the seat of the legislative appointment. So Jared is obviously filling the seat of the legislative appointment, and TJ was serving on behalf of Commissioner Tierney as a designee. And so going forward, as we think about someone to fill TJ's spot, we'll be looking and thinking about another council member who is an administration official or a designee on their behalf.
Yeah, just to go back to what Jane said about the process in terms of, those subcommittee composition changes going before the steering committee. I think it's, I believe every single time that there's been a consensus recommendation from the subcommittee that those have been kind of approved. So even if there is still another step here, I think it would be good to pause to see if that's a consensus recommendation around Claire joining as a subcommittee member. That'll be helpful clarity, I think, to the steering committee to then move on that. Which seems like something we can do now, but I think we also need to outline a broader process to surface additional nominations and be able to, I mean, there will be the question of the co-chair position. I think, we've also talked about some gaps in subcommittee kind of expertise or experience that would be helpful to add to, especially as we kind of are at a natural kind of breathing point and post climate action plan and pre really getting into the measuring progress and some of the responses to the RFIs and digging in further on different pieces of analysis. So I guess I would suggest that be good to identify a timeline to surface new nominations, have those considered, and then kind of round out at least subcommittee composition for the near future, between now and our next meeting. I think we can always make changes as things change, as people step down or we see a need, but it might be helpful to try to get the subcommittee to a place where it feels like it's set for roughly the next year, and make those changes and additions kind of at the same time.
So in doing that, I wonder if just taking a second to look at what's ahead of us in terms of scope of work is useful. And it's well, clearly the reviewing the RFI, responses and then development of a request for proposal and the process that goes on after that, helping to advise A&R and managing the technical consultant that is hired in that process is a big scope of work. The monitoring and assessment work, I think, is also going to be an important scope of work as well. One other piece that I can think of, at least immediately, is that we have this model, the LEAP model, that is tracking our progress. It's related to monitoring and tracking, but just really one of the things I've been touting about that, and hopefully what I've been saying comes true, is that the LEAP model is really useful in that we will have a license to it, and the department and A&R can operate it and use it going forward. And so I think there's a role for this committee. There's a role for the council. I actually starting down this path, and I'm not sure the role for either this committee or the cross-sector mitigation committee to be reviewing results from that. It kind of hangs in the balance between committees, and so there may be things that belong here and other things that belong there. So just thinking about expertise, that just may be something to keep in mind. One other piece that's related to there's also the carbon budget, which we didn't mention that earlier today, but it's related to the inventory, but different. That's been a lot in the ag subcommittee, but I think it's important for this subcommittee to have a role in that and in the carbon budget as well, and coordinating. And actually, I think I'll no longer be the co-chair, but this committee should probably take a lead role in that process as well. Would be my recommendation, I guess.
I think that's a great list, TJ. I would just add to it. I'm sure there are others, but one that's in my mind that was kind of a leftover that was not fully resolved when the initial climate action plan was passed, was some of the questions around biomass related recommendations. And I know that there are many subcommittees that have interest in some information to lend there, including ag and ecosystems and just transitions and cross sector. But I could also imagine a role for one or more members of this subcommittee in that conversation.
Absolutely.
And then there is also the municipal vulnerability index that, as I understand it, another subcommittee is taking lead on, but people on this subcommittee certainly have expertise to offer, like especially Leslie Ann.
Yeah, I'll just comment on that and suggest that that is the other remaining requirement that we envision spending our fiscal year 22 technical analysis funds on. That work will start is tasked directly to the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee, but we expect that.
Oh, Jane, I think we lost you, or at least I did.
Yeah.
She can't hear us either. I think her headphones have disconnected. I'll message her.
I think she got it.
I can just
Jane's
follow up on
waiting
what-
to sort of.
Well,
So-
go ahead, Lizzie Ann.
Yeah, I was
gonna-
about to. No, we're like
Go for
each
it.
talking each other. So while Jane's trying to reconnect here, I wanted to let the subcommittee know that I submitted the entire plan to the NOAA Climate Resilience Toolkit, and that's now part of all of the resources that are available for people worldwide. And one of the things that they do in the toolkit is to have 5 steps to resilience, 5 steps to vulnerability. And so as we sort of tap into that and move forward, the folks at the toolkit end are standing ready to help us with, creating all of the various types of vulnerability indices that we have. And the other folks who have some vulnerability expertise that we could also sort of tap into is the Vermont Department of Health, where they've got their, heat vulnerability and social vulnerability indices that we can also be sort of leveraging. So just wanted to put those 2 pins in there so that we, keep them tracked as we look forward. So Jane, are you back now? But you have to say something.
That's my second time.
There we go.
Yeah, I heard you reference. I came back on as you were referencing the Department of Health. So I don't know if you referenced any other additional resources to think about.
The Climate Resilience Toolkit that NOAA has out.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the plan's been submitted to that. It's now top on the reports page, and some of the folks are actually going to be coming out to Vermont next month, I think it is. So if there's a chance or opportunity to have them sort of brought into some of our conversations while they're on site, that would be good.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing resource. What I was trying to say before I cut out was that the 2 highest priorities that ANR has seen and understands based on the remaining statutory requirements of the GWSA are with the remainder of our fiscal 22 funds associated with technical analysis is to support the development of the measuring and assessment tool, as well as the municipal vulnerability index. Those are our highest priorities right now. And the municipal vulnerability index, while it has specific home and rural resilience and adaptation, it surely has broader interests for folks and expertise from other subcommittees to help participate in shaping what that will look like. So the subcommittee is meeting next Tuesday. It'll be a focus to sort of approve a process to develop what the scope of work would look like. And we would love to have representation on a small group who starts to think about that process from the Science and Data Subcommittee. You, of course, Leslie Ann, if you were willing to help advise us on the development of that, or at least point us correctly to the resources we should be looking at. And then we've been thinking a lot about the overlap with just transitions as well, and trying to get expertise from that subcommittee as well. So that's something that we hope in the course of the next 6 to 8 weeks that we'll be working to put together what the scope of work would look like. That might be unrealistic, but that's our hope as of now. And then we would go through the RFP process to have somebody come on board to support that work.
Or somebody tells me I'm muted, we'll touch base offline to get on each other's calendar.
So in thinking about a process for nominations, I think that's at least a general list of tasks that we need to tackle. And there's sure to be more as we go forward, but it might be useful to, have a time where nominations are made by subcommittee members, and we could also, I don't know if we want to ask the steering committee or the council, Jane or Secretary Moore, if they want to make nominations also for this committee at all. I don't know if that's appropriate or not, but and then have a period of review with a group, a work group of this committee to actually review and say that this person's skill set really matches up with the work that we need to do, and we'd like to add them. Does that make sense for a process?
Yeah, I mean, I need to do a little internal work. I had meant to have a couple of conversations and just haven't gotten to it since the holidays. But in general, yes, although not right this second.
So does it make sense to I guess ask, I don't know when is there a steering committee before next week's climate council meeting? No, it's already happened. So I'm not sure when the next opportunity, if we want to go in that direction, but it may be having a week or two to develop nominations, and then a work group to review them.
That sounds great, TJ. I was just going to suggest that I did send you and Jared an email just drawing your attention to, on the council agenda, there's a chance to highlight the subcommittee update and work planning. And so that those conversations are supposed to be short and sweet to sort of inform and educate the council about work planning for the upcoming year. And I think that would be a really appropriate space to also note the shifting composition of the Science and Data Committee in order to meet the objectives that you see for the coming year, and ask the council if they have any recommendations to direct them to you both, or maybe not to you, TJ, maybe just to Jared and others.
And Jane, I'm not,
maybe Jared and myself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Sorry, that sounds good to me. I guess one question I have, because I wasn't seeing it on my calendar, is when that next steering committee meeting is, just in terms of, we don't have one on the calendar. I mean, I think it would be good to see if we can have this nomination process kind of play out such that it can then be kind of brought before them at their next meeting, or us at our next meeting. I don't know, this also gets to the question of the frequency of which this subcommittee is meeting. If it's more like monthly, then maybe we could do this, accomplish that within the next month, and have some new folks for consideration by that next month, and then on board perhaps at the meeting after that. But I agree that I think it would be good to share this work plan with the council and consider nominations, both in terms of expertise and perspective that are important to inform those different pieces of our subcommittee work plan, either that we're doing or that we're kind of reviewing and providing input on. So I'm happy to work with you, Jane, to advance that as we figure out just the different components of the timeline and how they fit together as different things get added to the schedule. And thank you, Leslie Ann, for sharing your schedule. If others know that they have recurring conflicts as we think about kind of a regular subcommittee meeting time, I think that would be good to surface. But I think generally, I mean, that kind of the work plan will eventually kind of inform the frequency of meetings. But to start out, it seems like we may be able to be more on kind of I would suggest, I wonder what others think, but it seems to me early on, we don't necessarily need more than a monthly frequency to start.
Just to piggyback on that, Jared, I don't know if you've heard from Jay or not, because he might be the other person to sort of really tap into and consider, especially since his teaching load is a whole lot heavier than mine. And, you know, as we think about additional folks coming on, you know, if we do end up with more academics, we also need to sort of like keep that in mind too. So at some point it might help to have a list of either types of expertise or agencies that we might want to at least think about considering with our expansion. You know, federal agencies, I don't think we've ever talked about. That could be one way of sort of broadening the perspectives, for example. Making sure we've got that geographic distribution. I think somebody had mentioned in either one of the subcommittees on the council that we're either I-89 heavy or 91 heavy, and sort of making sure that we have all of the regions of the state being covered. And then there's a content expertise. And since we are the science and data subcommittee, if there are pieces in terms of either big data or data science or, you know, social sciences and some of those other ones that we may not necessarily have considered, economics we talked about, circling back around. So if there's a way of sort of collecting all of these various possibilities so that as we kind of step through, we know that we're not trying to like miss things here.
Agreed. And I think that a starting point can be the criteria we used last time, although we may want to add to that, including the specific portions of the work plan that we've identified. But I think that I totally agree with you, Leslie, and that those criteria are important. And I think most of, if not all of those, are in that initial kind of set that we did when we were first crafting the subcommittee. So hopefully we can build on that.
So any other thoughts on the work plan or the composition of the committee that we can address now?
I mean, it might be, I mean, maybe this is better to do by email, but I think maybe we could just do a quick kind of go around in terms of those elements of the work plan where we know subcommittee members will want to engage. So we can see kind of which ones where we have multiple subcommittee members who want to be involved in helping move those forward versus where there may be some gaps. You know, for instance, you know, RFI review, RFP development on life cycle, I would assume that would continue to include, you know, the team from DEC and ANR, and then Richard and I'm looking for Richard's head nodding. He's interested in continuing to do that. Measuring and assessing progress. I mean, I would assume that would be certainly Claire from PSD, team from ANR, myself, and May from EAN. Others?
I've been involved with that to a minor degree.
The municipal vulnerability index, it sounded like Leslie Ann and some suggestions there that of folks who aren't necessarily on the committee now, but are adjacent or may end up being on the committee in the future, who knows. Biomass, it seems like, I don't know, Richard, you've had a lot of focus there. I know the PSD and ANR have a lot of expertise and interest in that as well.
Yeah, just on those last two, I think in the Rural Resilience Committee, I know, Ann Margolis from our PSD staff is participating in that committee as staff, and will be at a minimum following that conversation. We have to see how in depth she can go, but and on biomass, I know that's coming up in the cross-sector mitigation committee, and particularly as it relates to electricity production from biomass. But my guess is that I'm going to be involved in that, so I may not be going far from these topics, but
what about others? I was just doing that off the top of my head. I didn't mean to suggest people if that was inappropriate, and I may have missed folks, but I think it would be helpful to just kind of get an initial sense if there are gaps. And then there was the carbon budget piece, which I think has a clear interrelation with the inventory, and we learned the hard way that we need to make sure that there's clear communication and alignment between those two conversations. So I'm assuming that would be the same group that is looking at some of these life cycle and inventory related questions, but I'm sure there are also additional pieces of expertise that would be helpful as that carbon budget discussion advances. So it seems like there's 2 or 3 folks from the subcommittee on each of those pieces of the work plan, but there are certain perspectives or types of expertise that could be really helpful to add to one or more of those parts, along with all the other criteria that we've previously discussed and that Leslie Ann just shared as well. So yeah, I don't mean to take more time here, but happy to, if that sounds good to folks, happy to work with Jane on helping move that forward.
I think we were somewhat limited several months ago by not having anybody on the committee who has expertise as an economist. I think that was that limited our work.
Agreed.
So Jared, it might be helpful just for the public record to list who is on the subcommittee with all of the various changes that have been mentioned in the last half an hour, just so that we know who's who.
When we send out the call for nominations?
No, but like right now, so it could be minuted so that we know who's on the subcommittee and who's either transitioning to other subcommittees or doing other stuff. So.
Yeah, Jane or Marion, do you have handy the list, the approved list that we can maybe screen share and reference for that?
I think I could probably. Oh, you have it?
You want there? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Hold on. Let's see if it's actually open. I have it. Just hold on a second. The resource page opened, but then it didn't actually open the document. It says, can't reach this page. So I wanted the resource page link, but we did just get an email about internet connectivity problems. Marion, can you open it? Or
I think that's the issue, but I think I have it on my local drive and can pull it up and share it. Just give me a moment.
Yeah, Marion recently updated it and put an updated version online.
Can you all see that?
Yes.
And if I could scroll down, there's state staff listed, but I figured you all wanted to see membership.
Yeah, it looks like some state staff. I know Andrea Wright's still listed, so that's something I must have missed, but she is staffing now cross-sector, is my understanding, and wants to be kept apprised of this, but she has a new role with the agency, transportation, so we should probably take her off this as official staff. And then we should confirm that Brian still wants to participate, and Jared, that could be on you and I because he hasn't been to a meeting in a while.
I know
and
his
so based
schedule
on-
got really difficult in the fall, and he had made the decision to prioritize the council meetings and wasn't able to attend. But I don't know if that is going to be a continuing thing, and we should just, or if that was temporary. Yeah.
And I think that's part of the reason why I wanted us to just take a look at the list and sort of pause and see where we are currently before we sort of move forward, because we would smallest group to start with, and it sounds like we may have shrunk a little bit more. So, you know, that will sort of set up how we kind of step forward.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then I have Kashka, if you're still, I can't see if you're still with us, but we have Danielle Bombardier listed. Yeah, we have Danielle listed as the liaison from Just Transitions, but we don't have you officially listed. And Danielle was joining for a while, but we should correct that if you have been serving that role and that was a misrepresentation by us.
Sure. Whatever you think. I mean, I'm happy to attend. I do take notes.
That's great.
Thanks, Kashka.
I'll circle up with you and Danielle just to make sure that Danielle doesn't want to be listed also, and that you're the official liaison.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Kashka. And then maybe the state staff, if you scroll down, Marion, so we'll pull Claire up into subcommittee members. And then based on official state staff, we'll remove Andrea. We have Bennett listed here, but I'll ask Megan and Colin if you'd like to be listed. You generally participate. It feels official to me. And then, of course, we might want to follow up with John Adams, who hadn't been able to diligently prioritize this. I know he did participate here and there, but he, based on the Municipal Vulnerability Index and the Measuring Progress tool, he would be a really great asset or someone from DCGI going forward. So he might be someone that we would want to consider as a full subcommittee member, or at least have somebody as state staff here.
I would definitely second that, Jane.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think this was helpful. Thank you, Marion, for pulling it up, and Leslie Ann for suggesting that. So I think we have a path. We're saying we, maybe I should start to say you have a path forward here to talk about nominations. It'll get brought up at the Monday council meeting, which was either Jared or I could do that. I was planning on attending also, so we'll talk about that, Jared. But how, I guess the question is how long we should leave it open for, and should there be maybe a core group, or maybe, well, it can't be the whole committee without it being a public meeting. So a core group that reviews the nominations. I wonder if that should be selected now so that folks know.
Be happy to help with that if you need it.
Great, thanks, Leslie Ann. Jared, as the, I guess, just chair for now, you're probably on that group. You're not a co-chair for the time being.
I would be happy to. I think it'd be helpful to have, I mean, I assume Jane will participate anyway, so maybe that's kind of, but like Claire or somebody else from Hannah, I think could be helpful too.
I'm happy to help.
I didn't mean to volunteer you, Claire. I'm just saying, as we think through the different, great.
Well, I was on the edge and so you pushed me over.
Great. So should we set a deadline for nominations so that that group has a target? If this group is going to meet monthly, maybe 2 weeks.
2 weeks, yeah, that sounds about right.
Great. Sorry to drive the conversation when I'm stepping out of the committee.
No,
but,
it's good, TJ.
So 2 weeks for nominations, and then that small group that just identified themselves could set up something for after that to discuss what they've received and talk about it at the next meeting.
I think that sounds great. If it sounds good to everybody else.
Is there anything else to discuss prior to our second round of public comment on either the monitoring assessment or subcommittee composition?
Just put into the chat, the director of the National Climate Assessment just sent out that the state climate summaries are available. They were just released today. And so I just put the link directly to the Vermont state summary so that we can either update the links that are currently in our plan or share widely with all of your networks and your groups. So this is like the most cutting edge stuff in terms of the materials, the data, but also the projections moving forward for the state. And so they've done this for all 50 states, Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So yeah, have at it. We've been waiting for it. So happy it's out.
Great, thank you. Looks pretty cool. I opened it and I probably shouldn't have. So great. Well, I am not sure if there's still any members of the public here. Oh yeah, Stephen's here. And if there's anybody else that I can't see, if you want to comment, now is your opportunity. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thanks. I just want to add my voice to appreciation for you, TJ and Lou, for the work that you've done. It's been monumental effort here, and you've done a great job balancing, various points of view and tough issues to move forward through, and you've kept things moving, and it's been great to watch. And I'm sure that I'll run into you in your work on cross-sector mitigation as well, but thank you.
Oh, thank you for that. And yeah, I appreciate all the comments, but really it was the committee working with the committee and Stephen, your comments, and George and everybody else who participated from the public and that have really made this work pretty productive and made this go forward in a really robust and transparent and just good manner. Seemed slow at times, but I do think we've made a ton of progress. So and more to come, and I'm sure all of the rest of you are going to keep this committee going really well. So confident in that. All right, I can stop blushing now. All right. So thanks everybody. I think that we can call it a day for today. Thank you all, and have a great rest of the afternoon.
Thanks all.
Thanks everybody.
Thank you. Take care.